thing that I found particularly interesting in the quotations that I got from that from Putin was he, and one of the reasons he was so insistent about Chechnya not seceding is because he didn't want this particular area to become a Yugoslavia for Russia. And I think that's an interesting, you're talking about geography there. And so I think it's obvious you have the Caucasus Mountains that are there, like in the Balkans region, former Yugoslavia. You have, it's a very mountainous region. You have these blend of ethnicities, a blend of religions in there that make things very complex. And, Yugoslavia itself has a role to play in the outbreak of the First World War. It also has a role to play as disintegration in the 1990s with Slobodan Milosevic. And so, those types of concerns and the idea that Putin did not want to see a trend development of different regions within Russia succeeding, because at the end of the day, even though when we talk about politics in Moscow and coming out of Moscow, the ruling party or whatnot, it generally is Slavic at its core, right? Yeah. But at the end of the day, Russia is very much, considering how much it encompasses, going all the way to the Pacific and extending down into the regions that it does, and butting up against Eastern Europe. It's very much a multi-ethnic society, and I think that's what's curious. You have that Slavic core, and there's the Slavic peoples in Poland, right, and in other places, former Czechoslovakia. So they're elsewhere. But what's curious is, politically, to keep things simple, when we talk about history, we talk about the Slavs, or the Russians, for the most part. But when you get down into Chechnya, when there's a host of different ethnicities, religions.
Muslim is one of the biggest.
Yeah, exactly. So you go to Georgia, that particular region where Joseph Stalin is from, those people are traditionally Christians. You have some Armenians that are Christian as well. And then you come specifically to the case of Chechnya, or Chechens, people that are part of the Caucasus language group, and they do tend to be Muslim. They come from a tradition that, especially some of what I suppose Putin would call them, Chechen rebels that come from the 1800s, that he sort of sees these modern day rebels in sort of the mindset going back to that time period, the 1800s. You have a series of czars that sort of bring the Chechens to heel, if you will, and incorporate these territories along with Georgia, Azerbaijan, those particular regions into the larger Russian fold. And the resistance that comes back extends all the way to 1859. It's really only concluded by 1864. Is that you have Sufi Muslims that are not quite Sunni, but perhaps more Shiite. They have a hybrid, and they have a mystical tradition that we would probably recognize in the jihadists. They have that aspect of the glory of dying for Allah and whatnot, and you find that actually in the 1800s. It's not actually a Chechen rebel that is the one. It's actually Avar, A-V-A-R. His name is translates as Samuel the All-Embracing, and he is one of these almost like from the American Wild West type characters. But in the Caucasus Mountains of Eurasia, that area there, he is someone that is very aware of, quite a guerrilla rebel. I think that's the key. And he goes so far as the Russians have great difficulty capturing him and quelling his rebellion, his dislike of the Russians wanting to incorporate this region into the larger Russian empire of the time. And it goes so far that when he's actually captured in the 1850s, they bring him to Moscow and St. Petersburg eventually, and he's wined and dined. He's treated with great respect because he was such a warrior. And so for many in the present day, and whenever you have Jakhar Dudiev, who's the main secessionist, he was actually part of the Soviet military, Air Force, I believe, whenever he succeeds in the mid-1990s, he's the one that leads it. He's the independent government there, and he invokes imagery going back to Samuel of the 50s sort of rebel. And he also invokes, my understanding, is imagery of what happened to Chechens during the Second World War. Because apparently during the Second World War, Joseph Stalin felt that certain Chechens supported the Germans there, and thus as a result he carts ships that trailed rail transport out to Siberia. And so whenever you had the rebellion in the 1990s, Jakhar Dudiev is his name, he invokes that those earlier images both back in the 1800s and the Second World War, which is interesting, I think, historically, that historical connection. Outside of that, what direction would you like to go?
Could you say that the Chechen, I mean, like obviously historically it's been seen that wars have very much started to benefit a nation or a politician in a sense. With Putin's rise to power, which it can obviously be connected to the Chechnya war, is it right to say that he could have just done it to benefit his own election to kind of prosper himself?
I think to a certain degree you could. I think you could say that because my understanding is part of his popularity in the early 2000s is when in polling that they actually do, in opinion polls in Russia, a lot of his popularity does derive from that. And apparently there are opinion polls that support that there. So I think that's certainly part of it. It helps him to consolidate his power. On another level, I think, too, just to sort of be fair and try to be as objective as possible in regards to the developments there, is that he doesn't, because Chechnya's particular location, I mean, if that particular region succeeds, and this particular ethnic group, and we're talking about a region that's about the size of the state of Connecticut, and you're talking about a population of, if I'm not mistaken, about 1.2 million, three-quarters of them are Chechens, the other quarter is predominantly Russian there, and so the precedent of one state succeeding from Russia would set a precedent for this larger multi-ethnic empire of others doing the same. And the question is, where would it stop? Where would it stop? And what would be left of Russia if a trend of different ethnicities splitting apart and forming their own countries? Because you're talking about ethnic groups extending all the way to the Pacific and into more Eastern, Middle Europe, Central Europe there. And so that process he didn't want to permit. And another curious aspect of it is that Chechnya, where it's located, is actually not is close to a border region, but it's not on the border. And so you would have this curious independent country pocket.
Kind of like Alaska?
Yeah, kind of. I guess the way to think about it more would be that it would be like, say, a state within the United States, if the president wanted to succeed, it would be, say, a country, and I'm sort of just thinking off the top of my head, like Tennessee. Yeah. I mean, it's surrounded by other U.S. states that want to stay within the United States, and thus, whenever they're landlocked. And Chechnya is like that. It doesn't have access to the Black Sea. It doesn't have access to the Caspian on the other side. It is hemmed in over here by Georgia, down here by Azerbaijan, and then other particular regions. And so, so that represents an independent country within Russia, historic Russia itself. So logistically, that would be
awkward. Okay. Now going back to our conversation about converting from communism to a democracy, and whether you believe that would be a success or not.
Right. Whether it be a success to convert to democracy. Well, I guess go back to personally as a historian. I always think first as a historian is that you do have that tradition that we made mention of earlier, that Russia is, going back to Peter the Great in the 1700s, you do have this attitude that democracy, the Russian people are not cut out for democracy, and historically that has been absolutely true. In the 1917 revolution, everyone remembers, because the Bolsheviks win. They remember the revolution that comes later in the year, October, November, those particular years. But it's easy to forget that going back to the earlier part of 1917, there was more what we would call a liberal democratic movement. And there was Alexander Kerensky, who, if he had been successful, as opposed to, say, Joseph Lenin, Trotsky and eventually Stalin, if Kerensky had been successful, but who knows, Russia might have had a successful experiment with democracy, because that was more the European English parliamentary style. In a certain sense, Kerensky was a centrist, we would say. But what happens in the end, you have these extreme leftists, these communists, they come in and take over, and it seems like I'm being sarcastic, and on some level I am, but on another, it's just sort of an interesting connection, because what the Communist Party does, and especially by the time you get to the late 1920s and to Joseph Stalin, I mean, he really does have all the powers and authority that essentially the czars had had previously without the connection of divine right.
It's kind of like a monarch system. You have this one leader.
Exactly. This one leader that becomes a monarch, but without calling him a monarch. And so I've always thought that he's a czar, but his official title is the General Secretary, which sounds very innocent, but but at the same time it turns out to be not so.
Honestly, a democracy for Russia is kind of unfeasible, even in the current state.
Well, see, I don't want to like hem them in about them, about what they can become, because I think any country can, or any peoples or ethnicity can become really whatever they want to become. I mean, there's always that choice involved with historical development, but it does come back to the issue, to me, of historical development. Is the idea of what has a country been prepared for? Because to make a democracy function in the truest sense of the word, you have to have several things: a certain level of literacy, so that people can make informed choices when they vote. It's not to say they always do, but they can sort of make informed decisions there. And then also respect for the rule, quote unquote rule of law there. And many critics, and at this point I'm echoing some things that you might hear from say the U.S. government and the president, that there's not much respect for the rule of law within Russia in the present day. And I'm not really here to say whether that's true or not, but there is that critique there, and there are rumors of organized crime that runs a little rampant. The organized crime does sort of segue upward the political elites, which makes it very dicey when you start thinking in those directions. But the rule of law is another necessity there, and sometimes that seems to be lacking there. And I think in the case of the first Chechen War from 94 to 96, you see that? And then some of the events that we talked about coming from the 2000s.
So playing with the idea of having corruption through organized crime groups, would you say that corruption is a key part of many political aspects of Russia at the moment, especially with, the intelligence agencies, as I was saying?
My understanding that is, and I only know what I read there, so, and going back, I'm a historian, so I know more about what happened 100 years ago than the dust, what is taking place in the present day, that has the dust is yet to settle. My understanding is that there is a common critique coming from the West, how true it is, or if it's true at all, I cannot say. But at the same time, there is that critique of organized crime within Russia, and crime, what we would call Russian crime rings that extend all the way to places like the Netherlands and things of that sort. And my understanding is whenever some of the events take place in the 2000s regarding Chechnya, is that the Russians will blame Putin's administration, will blame Chechen crime rings and their activities in Moscow and other places, but even some Russian historians will say, well, that there was maybe some aspect of that, but there was also a healthy dose of Russian crime rings that were probably more responsible than Chechens. So it's hard to equivocate when you ask me that question, but it's difficult to, I don't want to be the judge and the jury of Russia and things of that sort in that particular case. But I do hear those rumors, and so sometimes